Good evening and welcome to the next edition of our mini webinar series on designing games for professional military education. Tonight we're going to head to Australia, who have been pioneers in both the analog and digital wargaming space. We're going to look at one of the systems, one of the many systems that they have. I caveat early on this point because I know my guest speaker tonight has got many examples to tell us. One of the systems they are rolling out now to help their professional military education. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome to the stage Major Andrew Somerville. So, Andrew, welcome. Would you like to introduce yourself and explain a bit about your background in the military and how you got into wargaming and how you got into this particular project?
Yeah, thanks very much, Ed. So the first point I'll just make that these are obviously my opinions rather than those of the Australian Department of Defence, the Australian Army, or the Battle Lab, which is the unit that I come from. So my background, I've been in the Army now for 4 decades. I started as a soldier, a paratrooper before attending the Officer Cadet School and commissioning, and then returning back to infantry. I've been a Rifle Platoon Commander, motorised battalion. I've been the operations officer of a parachute battalion. I've been the battalion second in command of a mechanised battalion and also an acting commanding officer. I've fulfilled a number of operational staff jobs. I've been an operational planner at battalion, brigade and divisional level, and also in the joint environment. And I've also undertaken a number of training jobs. So that's my military background. But as a wargamer, that all started when I came across Don Featherston's book on wargaming in high school, and that's what started me down the pathway of recreational wargaming, starting with miniatures, predominantly focused on World War II and the European theatre. I also then discovered the traditional hex and counter games that were being produced by Avalon Hill and SBI, and I've been playing those for a long time as well. And that's my sort of initial exposure and experience with recreational wargaming. But I became a serious wargamer in about 10 years ago. So around about 2016, 2017, I was the Staff Officer Grade 2 simulation policy. That's when I first started to become quite deeply involved in the writing of simulation policy, looking at simulation systems and simulators. And at that point, I started trying to point out the importance of both using manual and digital war games. It's about the same time that the US Army, and in particular the Secretary of Defense in the US, issued his memo, which basically directed the US military to look at wargaming. Similar thing happened in the Australian Army approximately 5 years ago. 2-star General, the Commander of Forces Command, issued a directive effectively saying that the Australian Army needs to reinvigorate the use of wargaming. And that's where I became much more deeply engaged in serious wargaming, and I was able to basically help with the development and writing of doctrine, and then took up this particular post where I'm now the Staff Officer Grade 2 wargaming simulation within the Army Battle Lab, and where I've been again advocating for manual games for educational wargaming, the support training, and I've subsequently developed a number of manual games, one of which obviously is Australian Platoon Commander, which is what we're going to be discussing. So that's basically my background, both military, how I got involved in wargaming, and more importantly, serious wargaming. which leads us neatly into discussing Australian Platoon Commander.
Yeah, I just want to highlight as well that not many armies have an SO2 or SO1 or SO3 wargaming. But I'd also highlight that that in itself does not mean you have a wargaming capability or that you have a culture of wargaming, and often that is the sticking plaster solution some armies go for. So it's great to see that you both have the title and do the role and are having some success. So without further ado, we're going to talk about the box on the left. Platoon Commander. My first question as ever to everyone who comes on for this is, what drove the requirement for this wargame?
So as I indicated, I'm a strong advocate for the use of manual wargames as education and training tools. And I was pushing for the development of a number of manual games. I briefed my commander, the commander of the Battle Lab, and explained to him that I thought that there was an opportunity for us to develop a series of war games which could be used in our training establishments. My commander basically asked me to develop a single war game which would go from section up to the joint task force level. And I quickly pointed out to him that that was basically an impossibility. It's extremely difficult to develop a single war game that could cover that span of operations. And I suggested that we develop a series of games, which ultimately is what he agreed to. And one of those games is Australian Platoon Commander. Another one of the games that we won't talk about in detail is called Australian Combined Arms, which is the other is an expansion to Sebastian J. Bay's wargame, the Littoral Commander Indo-Pacific game, and we've created an expansion which brings all the ADF, the Australian Defence Force capabilities, to that game. But to get back to Australian Platoon Commander, so I had started looking at developing this platoon game. And again, fortunately for me, the Royal Military College was going through a restructure of its curriculum. And the curriculum has gone from an 18-month course to back to a 12-month course. And so they needed to look at smarter and more efficient ways of delivering training. And I literally bumped into the commander of the Land Combat College, Brigadier, and he and I had served together in Afghanistan, and he asked me what I was doing. I explained what I was doing, and I was pretty cheeky, and I said, "Sir, it'd be really, a great opportunity if I could look at developing and introducing a manual platoon level game for use at the Royal Military College." And he said, "Yeah, that sounds like a great idea, Andrew. Just get after it." That gave me the opportunity to engage the Royal Military College. And because they were looking at this curriculum change, there was a fantastic opportunity to look at other ways that they could deliver tactics training. And what ultimately happened was the Royal Military College adopted the use of digital wargaming and manual wargaming. The digital game, which is one that we have and use across the Army, is Steel Beast Professional. It's a simulation that we have in our battle simulation sites. So the Battle Lab has got 6 battle simulation sites which support our combat brigades. They're in all the major brigade locations and also in the major training establishment locations around Australia. And the organisation that I come from manages those sites and the capability. But more importantly was the development of Australian Platoon Commander. And I spoke to the Deputy Chief Instructor and asked about, well, what is it that you need? And we went through the normal process of me working with the sponsor, being the Royal Military College, determining what was the purpose of the war game, what were the specific objectives, the learning objectives in particular that they wanted to achieve with this particular game. And then ultimately developing a prototype, running some beta testing with some cadets, and then with that acceptance of the game as it was developed, I was able to then go back to my commander and say, "Hey, sir, look, we're having some really good success here. I would now like to have a professional game made." And so ultimately that's what happened. We produced 100 copies of the game, and it's been quite successful to the point where we're now doing another production run of 500 games. And it is now being looked at by other combat schools in the Australian Army as a potential training tool to be used for platoon and up to combat team level tactics, although its focus is very much at the platoon level.
That's great. So a couple of things I'm going to sort of highlight there is firstly, Duntroon Military College is reducing its curriculum by a third and is adding wargaming. There are many military colleges out there that could be accused of being guilty of lengthening their courses, or at least not shortening them, and not finding a day or a week to run any wargaming whatsoever. So I think that's a great model for others to look at what was cut based on prioritization of learning. Also want to just highlight the great graphics you've put onto the box, and the fact that you made a physical box and you're going to issue out a physical box, because again, that is something where the system is designed centrally and is posted up on a digital platform such as SharePoint, and is then people are told then to go get it and print it themselves. And these are all barriers and hurdles to adoption. And the fact that no money was invested in making the box look visually appealing, and it is in one. Other examples could just be a blank box that just has Calibri fonts on it. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think good looking box, but it is definitely a seller. I now have people who actually come up and ask where they can buy one. Unfortunately, it's not a commercially available product. But now I put a lot more store in the idea of having a really nice box, which is appealing because people then want to open the box, look what's in it, and actually want to play the war game, and that's very important for take up. And so, yeah, your point, Ed, is quite important, and it's something that I didn't put a lot of store in, and I did exactly what you said as well. The initial game was put up on the Defence intranet, so people could go to that site and drag down the rules, the PDFs, and so on. That product is still there, but what I find is, unless people are directed to go to that site and are directed to pull down the rules, it'll only be those individuals who are really invested or really keen on wargaming that will probably do that, even within our training establishments. But as soon as there's a shiny box and you show it to people, they want one. So that's a very valid point.
Okay, I'm going to move us on. So we're going to start talking about the heart of the game system. So I do this for a couple of systems. It generally gets to all the chrome that layered on top. At the heart of it, there's a mechanic or a series of mechanics. So extract this from the rules. You've got a preeminent rule, which I'll just highlight on the top right, which I've called the golden rule in some other ones, which means that if you can't find the answer in the rules, then you need to apply military judgment. And effectively, if it can't be done in real war, it shouldn't be done in the war game. I tell you, that was one of the first things you put in, Andrew.
Yeah, I think that's it's important. No rule set can cover everything. The level of fidelity in the rule system is driven by the learning outcomes, and also the ease of play. How much time do the players actually have available to sit down and play the game? And so you might come up with a game which doesn't necessarily cover everything. Otherwise, you would have a rule book which is probably a couple of inches thick, which would be really difficult to digest. And so having a preeminent rule about, hey, look, it needs to be anchored in reality, because one of the hurdles, again, about a war game is exactly that term, game, because people can think that they are playing something which is, a frivolous child's game. It's not taken seriously. Whereas you need to point out, no, this is a serious war game. It's anchored in reality. However, it will not necessarily be able to cover everything. So if you come across something and you go, well, there's no rule for this, then you should apply your professional judgment on what you believe is a appropriate rule given that particular circumstance. The other point that I made at the very end, and you've got it there, is again, I mean, this is a rule system designed by myself. Obviously, I have lots of experience, having served for a long time in the military and deployed on multiple operations overseas. But again, some of the rules may not accord with the professional judgment of others. I'm not a tanky. I'm not an expert when it comes to fighting with tanks, for example. So therefore, the modelling I might have used and what I have emphasised in this game when it comes to armoured engagements may not sit well potentially with the School of Armour, because they're trying to teach something else which was not part of this particular game system. And so I pointed out that, again, you should feel free to effectively house rule the system as well if you are not happy. And please, provide me with feedback as to the rationale behind why you don't agree with the rule, and I could clarify it as to the reasoning why I developed the rule the way I have, or it can acknowledge that, hey, actually, you are right, I have made a mistake, I need to amend the rule system.
That's great. And on the left-hand side, we've got the turn sequence from the rules. So you adopted an IGO-UGO system with a number of phased steps. Can you talk us through the design choices and any feedback that led to that?
Yeah. So again, anybody who's in a game design, particularly war game design, will know that there are a whole range of different turn sequences that potentially you could use, because it is extremely difficult to have synchronicity in a manual gaming system, unless you are prepared to sit there, write down your orders, and then you both read out orders at the same time and everything happens at the same time, which is really difficult to do. I was very cognizant of the load on the instructors or the facilitators for these war games, and also the fact that for the majority of the cadets that use this game, it's probably the first war game of this type that they have ever played. So I wanted a fairly simple game, and I wanted a simple turn sequence. I agree with Phil Saban's adage about the IGO-UGO system. I think there are certain advantages that by having an IGO-UGO system, plus military people tend to want to follow a set sequence. And it was interesting, I had a senior officer who was looking at this system, and he looked specifically at the turn sequence, and he said, Andrew, that's basically the process that I'd go through when I'm planning, which was a nice compliment, because that's exactly what I was trying to do. I was trying to indicate the sorts of things that you should be doing ISR before you worry about moving. And I've had movement before direct fire, and the reason why, as Professor Saban pointed out, is I want the players to accept risk and to move without necessarily knowing whether their fires were successful in suppressing an enemy position. Otherwise, what will happen is they'll fire, fail to suppress, and therefore choose not to move, if I had the turn sequence that way. But again, I wanted it also to be step by step to enable the instructors to be able to draw out particular lessons during gameplay if that was required. There is, in the advanced rules, another turn sequence where it's a little bit more interactive from the point of view of it's probably a better example of action, reaction, counteraction sequence in course of action wargaming that most military personnel will probably be aware of, where I might move one of my sections, my opponent then moves one of their sections or shoots with one of their sections, and then I take another action with another section. So it does have two turn sequences, but the basic turn sequence is the one that you've highlighted, and it is core to the game, exactly as you pointed out.
Okay, let's get some pictures of it. So this is an example of the game setup. As you can see, it's on a flat surface. And in both examples, I can see counters standing on an edge, creating a sort of single blind, minimalist and very effective fog of war appreciation for both sides. So you can only see the side facing yourself. So I'll let you talk through any bits of clarification on this, and then the pre-game preparation that the players do.
Yeah. So I'll talk about how the Royal Military College uses this particular tool now. And what normally happens is the cadets will be given a tactical problem. They'll undertake a tactical exercise with our troops, a TUT, where they have to develop a solution to that problem, and then they have to write a set of orders. What they are now able to do is to do post-HR decision-making, where the instructor can say to a cadet, right, well, you are going to fight your plan, and one of the other cadets, you are going to play red, and you are going to fight the most dangerous course of action that you came up with for red, so that we can stress the blue player's plan and potentially see if there are any weaknesses in the blue plan. So it's got to be adversarial. Any war game should be adversarial. Otherwise, I don't. For pre-game preparation, clearly you need a scenario, and you need to have a problem. And so, as I said, in RMC, they already have those, and there are specific tactical problems to learn about conducting the advance, conducting the attack, conducting the withdrawal, conducting defence, how to conduct ISR, etc. So they already have those, but clearly you need a scenario, and then you need to pick the battle space, and you need to create a model of the battle space. And as you can see, we're using military mapping, which has been blown up. So the grid squares are approximately 25 centimetres by 25 centimetres, subdivided by 100 metre squares. The reasoning behind that is just to make it easier to measure ranges and move distances on the map. I did speak to RMC about whether they wanted to use cloth models. Did they want to use maps? Did they want to use hexes? And in the end, though, they wanted to use normal military mapping. They were happy to go with a larger map because it reinforces the skill of map reading, navigating, and appreciating the ground by reading a map, because that's exactly what they're going to have to do in the real world. They either have to use a map, chart, or they're going to use a battle management system, which is going to have an electronic map. So we want the cadets to practice that and understand and make a trained appreciation by reading the map. Yes, it doesn't always necessarily have all the micro terrain that might be there, but that's, again, all about the fidelity in the game. So normally, yep, lay out your map. You will have an ORBAT, again, that would be given. The game tokens that you can see are basically MDF 20 mil by 20 mil squares with military symbology. There is nothing else on it. And they are basically, they can be either laid flat on the map, either face up, so you're playing an open game where nothing is hidden, you can see everything. You might play that when you first do the introductory game to learn the rules. And then you can play them either with the counter reversed, because the back of the counter only has basically either Australian or Olvanan camouflage, so you can't tell what the unit is, and you need to undertake some form of ISR in order to determine what the counter is. Or you can have them mounted on little perspex stands, as you can see, so that, again, you cannot tell what the counter represents until your opponent turns it around so you can read the military symbology. And he's only going to do that, or she is only going to do that, when either you have in the game flown a UAS over that counter and actually conducted some form of ISR to determine what it is, or you are within visual range of detection. So, for example, a moving armoured vehicle in the open can probably be seen from about 5 kilometres away, at which point you would be able to turn that counter around. Then there's the question of, well, how do you include deception in the game? So what I've also had in the game is dummy counters. So you can actually be moving dummy counters around as a feint, or you can have them established in certain areas to make a force look larger than it really is, or that you've got forces deployed in an area where there really aren't any forces. So that's part of deception planning. Why did I adopt this system rather than going to a double blind game? So again, remembering I wanted to keep it simple. This is the first game that cadets will become involved in, and in fact, for a lot of the instructors. So I wanted to keep it simple, but clearly I wanted a fog of war mechanic, and this is the one I selected. And it works quite well, but yes, there are still, you still have a pretty good idea of where the bulk of the forces are arrayed, because you can see the back of the counters. But you don't know exactly what they are. The only way you can go to a point where you don't know anything until you've got reconnaissance surveillance assets is to play either a double blind game or a half open, half closed game, which requires twice the number of maps, twice the number of counters, and doubles, or in fact almost triples, the cognitive load on the instructor who's trying to facilitate 2 small teams in 2 different rooms using radios or field telephone or whatever means of communication you're using between those 2 locations. Now, having said that, RMC actually does do double blind games, but they don't do that initially. That's a more advanced version of playing the war game, and they use exactly the same wargaming kit, similar sorts of problems, so they do play it double blind. But the majority of the games are played, as you can see, displayed here.
Awesome. Yeah, we are going to see some close-ups of the counters, so don't worry, everyone. This is just an overview screen. And there we are, components, maps, counters, and charts. You've already talked about the maps, so I think that's all well and good. We have some close-ups of some counter variations on the top right. So 3D printing the counters, the simple cutout and stand, slightly larger ones that we've seen here. This is a picture I found of a cloth model example, which again is an option. It has pros and it has cons. Might be worth, just for the sake of those people who've used cloth models or have come from a miniature wargaming background, to talk through why this was. You mentioned why the maps are an advantage. Was there any other negative side of why the cloth models were not selected?
I think the principal reason why the cloth model wasn't being adopted by RMC was, as I explained before, they wanted to ensure that the cadets are map reading and appreciating ground, because that's predominantly what you're going to do in the real world. You can, with the appropriately scaled counters and map, and this is one of the reasons why the grid squares are as large as they are. So the counters represent either a section, an individual vehicle, an individual weapon system, or a fire team. Now, that takes up approximately 100 metres of real ground. So 8 to 9 men, 10 metres between each man. So about 90 metres or thereabouts. Hence the reason why each counter fits in one of those squares. So again, if you need to appreciate frontages of forces, you need the playing surface to be appropriately scaled. The point with a cloth model is you can actually get the trainees to do train appreciation by building the model themselves, and then by pointing out to them, by again looking at a map and going, well, hey, your depiction of Hill 193 is not quite right. When I look at the map, you need to make some changes. So it could be used as a secondary tool for train appreciation. I do have rules for the use of miniatures. I have shown it to various TEs and so on, and it just doesn't seem to resonate with the training audience, or certainly perhaps not the training audience, but certainly the trainers, the instructors. I'm not sure why, because interestingly enough, this is something that back in the 80s we used to do. In fact, I know the British Army, the US Army, the US Marine Corps, the Australian Army, the Canadian Army, we all used to undertake manual wargaming before the advent of the home computer and then subsequently computer simulations. And we used to use cloth models, and we used to use 1/300 scale miniatures. And at the School of Armour, for example, they had a huge model of the training area, which was in the model room, in which they used to undertake a manual war game. I've read about similar things that happened in the US military where they were using Kempf. Canada was using Contact. I'm sure, Ed, you're probably aware of some of the British Army war games that were used right up to the 80s that used miniatures. But along came computers, digital wargaming suddenly was, that was the solution. What we failed to realise is that it's like any tool. If you give people a hammer, everything is a nail. What we need to do is give them a toolbox of different tools so they can select the appropriate tool for the learning outcomes they're trying to achieve. The top right-hand corner, again, was me trying to indicate to people, hey, look, you don't necessarily need to have the box set. You can create your own military symbols, as you said, 3D printed or on cardboard, etc., because you can download the rules, as I previously mentioned, and you can make your own maps of your own training areas. So that map is, in fact, part of the Puckapunyal military training area down in Victoria. And as I mentioned, the counters are MDF. I use 10-sided dice. And you can also see the 2-page quick guide. So with all my designs, I try to ultimately get the rule set down to a 2-page guide. So you read the rule book, and then you rely on the guide. And if you're not quite sure, you can go back to the rule book and look up the particular area and look at the detail in the rule book. But what I found, even the cadets, even while they have access to the rule book, they predominantly rely on that guide as the means by which they understand and apply the rules in the game. Why 10-sided dice versus 6-sided dice or any other multiple-sided dice? So 10-sided dice obviously enables you to use percentages. I just think percentages resonate more. Also, it enables players to go, well, I don't agree that the percentage likelihood of a hit is 60%. I think it's 70%. And so they know intuitively that, okay, so instead of rolling 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, I roll 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So it gives the players agency to make modifications to the rules if they chose to. Whereas if you use a D6 system, yes, they can do the same thing, but it is not readily apparent to them, why did I choose a value of 5 rather than a value of 4? They don't necessarily understand that level of thinking that went into the selection of what the dice roll result to achieve a hit or to locate something. How did I come about that? how did I arrive at a 1, 2, 3, 4? 50% is quite straightforward, right? Obviously, it's a 1, 2, or a 3, or a 4, 5, and 6. It's 60%. But if I say, well, what's a 75% roll? Then it's a little bit harder. Whereas with you're using 10-sided dice, much easier to get to 70% or 80%. And I'm not quibbling over an extra 5% because, again, I don't think the level of fidelity is required. I'm a big believer in it needs to be the model of combat that you have designed needs to be good enough that it meets the training audience professional military judgment. Now, if you're doing an analytical war game, then yes, you might want a very highly accurate model with significant fidelity. So you might be actually using 20-sided dice and be rolling, you've got a 97% likelihood of a hit and you need to roll 97 or below. But for this game, it doesn't require that level of accuracy or fidelity. That's probably a better term. And so I settled on using 10-sided dice.
All very clear. I just want to highlight the green icons. So we have a minefield, a bunker, and an IED. So I assume, therefore, these are sort of non-player owned battlefield enhancements, obstacles, and sort of trip you up things. Do you want to talk about them and then talk about the orange markers down here?
Yeah. So you're exactly right there, Ed. So green normally used to indicate obstacles, etc. And the idea was, so yes, if you wish, you may mark obstacles directly onto the map if it was tucked and so on, or you put an overlay down over the map. Or you can use counters. And again, you can either that you don't know what they are. Again, you've got to go across that counter, or you need to investigate what it is to determine whether it's a minefield, etc. There are obviously rules in the game to adjudicate mine strikes if you enter a minefield and so on. If you are faced by a double concertina wire, that will slow down your movement. So that's an obstacle that's in the rules again. So again, it has to be a complete game system to the point where I've included, as I said before, the use of UAS, joint fires, so mortar fire, artillery fire is in the game. I've got armoured vehicles are in the game as well, even though it's predominantly focused on point for the training at RMC. I wanted to ensure that it could be used in more widely in Army, in the other TEs, and in units as well for professional military education. The little orange counters are used to indicate suppression. So I have very much focused on the suppressive effect of weapon systems. You can still destroy units, and we'll talk about that later in the presentation. But one of the things that I have observed over the years is players become fixated on destroying things. 30 or more percentage point destruction, or the unit is no longer combat effective, and that's the way I describe it in the game. It doesn't necessarily mean that every member of that section has been killed. Perhaps 2 or 3 members of the section have been killed, and the remaining members of the section are now no longer combat effective, and so the section has been destroyed. But the game focuses on suppressing. If you get multiple markers on your unit, you've gone from being suppressed to being neutralised. If you get enough of those markers in one turn, noting that each turn is only modelling a few minutes of combat, section that got 3 of those markers would have suffered sufficient casualties that at least one of the fire teams is no longer combat effective. And what I would do then is replace the section counter and put down a fire team counter, which is one way of modelling the attrition in the game. You can destroy vehicles outright, clearly. If you hit a main battle tank with a Javelin top attack anti-tank guided missile, in all probability, that vehicle will be destroyed, i.e. it's been penetrated, one or two members of the crew have probably been killed, the remaining members of the crew probably bail out of the vehicle, or at a minimum, the vehicle has lost its main gun, no longer has any of its fire control systems, or it's been immobilised. So again, it's that level of fidelity that I chose, so that we don't go down the rabbit warren of detail that you find in a lot of recreational war games. Now, I'm not being critical of that. Recreational war games require a lot of what is called chrome or rivet counting, because like recreational players enjoy that. That's part of the enjoyment of playing those games. But in an educational game like this, we don't need that level of detail. It just slows down gameplay. And one of the other important points is I want the player making the sorts of decisions that they would make based on the role that the player is in. So in this game, the player is in the role of a platoon commander. I want the player making sorts of decisions a platoon commander makes. A platoon commander does not tell the left-hand rifleman in the left-hand section to engage a particular enemy weapon pit, for example. Right? That's the job of the section commander, or perhaps the 2IC or the fire team leader, not the platoon commander. The platoon commander's decision is all about getting the section in an appropriate position and time to deliver an effect on the enemy in accordance with his plan. They're the sorts of decisions I need the player making. So again, it's very important when we're now talking about design that you understand that, because if the whole game is about being a platoon commander, because ultimately I believe a war game is effectively a decision game. You are making decisions all the way through the game. We want them making not only tactically sound, appropriate decisions, which is part of the learning of playing this game, but the appropriate decisions that we would expect a platoon commander to be making, not the sorts of decisions that a rifleman would make. Or, if this was an armoured game, you wouldn't, as a troop leader, necessarily be telling, one of the vehicles to load sabo over an impact round. That's the job of the crew commander of the vehicle to do, based on the fire control order that the troop commander has actually issued. And that's all driven by what's the effect he's trying to achieve. So, long-winded answer to some of your questions, Ed. Sorry.
No, it's all good. It's all good. Reassuring level of detail would be the way I would phrase that. So moving us on to the other side of the coin, simplicity. You've covered a lot of this ground already, but I think the key things to focus on here are using that D10. You took a very deliberate approach of the only two numbers you need to hold in your head really are 6 under equals suppressed. And if you get down to 0 or below 0, then that's a destruction. You've covered the suppression mechanics and all that as well, so that's all good. And up on the right, we've got the modifiers that apply to this die roll to either push it up, which is generally speaking bad, or pull it down, which is generally speaking good. So again, some comments from you on why those design features would be good.
Yeah, so I didn't want to. Initially, I thought about modelling, the likelihood of achieving hits at certain ranges. In the end, I settled on, look, you're either within effective range or you're firing out too long or extended range. All the ranges are, of course, in accordance with our doctrine, and also it makes it easier if included in the game if they wish to. The 60% or the 6 or below number, where did that come from? I've been asked that a couple of times, and I just turn around and go, well, if you read some of our pamphlets when it comes to what is the minimum score you need to achieve on the range in order to qualify on the weapon system, it's at 60%. Now, a lot of our soldiers achieve much better than 60%, which is great. That's what we want. But that's how I arrived at 60% within effective range, kept it very simple. And then ultimately, yes, look, if you can get to 0 or below, then yes, that's extremely effective fire, and you have managed to actually destroy the element you're firing on. It hardly ever happens. The only way you're going to do that is by basically rolling a 1, and you need to be engaging the enemy inside an engagement area within effective range. So you've only really got about a 10% chance of doing one single roll and destroying dismounted infantry. So it's very difficult. So as I said, I emphasised the suppressive effect. And when I've been questioned about that, I used historical examples such as the Battle of Long Tan in Vietnam, where a rifle company fought for more than 4 hours against a regimental-sized enemy, and the number of casualties, as the same, were 18 KIA. Because I'm a former paratrooper, let's talk about 2 para at Goose Green. Again, a long night-day attack, multiple phase company attacks against a force that was 3 times its size. And then when you look at the numbers that were killed, again, I think it was around about 20 that were KIA, and about half that number that were WIA. So I'm trying to emphasise reality again, rather than what a lot of people have experienced, which is television shows and Hollywood movies, where that's quite unrealistic. But that's what they've seen, so that's their expectation. And almost invariably, cadets will, so how do I destroy this, sir? Well, you need to manoeuvre to an appropriate area. You need to suppress them. Where the real destruction happens is in the close combat. And that's probably the most complicated part of the rule system. You can see the dice laid out there. I use the SCRUD system, where you roll a quantity of dice based on the number of attackers versus the defenders. So in the example you can see there are, we're attacking a platoon, 2 sections up, 1 section to the rear, platoon headquarters in the centre there, attacking an enemy squad with a heavy weapon system. So you roll a single die for a single weapon system, and you roll a single die for a fire team. So red, you can see, is rolling 3 dice, but blue has got 2 sections, so 4 fire teams in the direct fight. Obviously, the depth section is not in this fight, in which case you would roll your 4 blue die and the opponent would roll the 3 red die. And then, as you can see, they're arrayed there from high to low. And for every dice that you beat by 2, you put a suppression marker on one of the enemy units. And you can very quickly, with decent dice rolls, overpower the enemy and destroy them in the close fight, which is in reality where a lot of the killing actually happens. It is in the close combat. It's doing the fight through. It's going from pit to pit. It's grenading. It's firing 66 into sangers, those sorts of things. And that's what the SCRUD mechanic was designed to replicate in this particular rule system.
And have you had any feedback on that system from cadets or other users?
So as I said, initially they're like, I don't quite understand. But once, as I just explained it, once I explain it that way, certainly the instructors get it. I've just come back from the School of Infantry and actually been training some of the staff at Tactics Wing on this game. And I pointed out to them that if you use this SCRUD system, it explains pictorially why there is advantage by attacking from a flank. So if we were attacking that enemy position from a flank, the enemy player would actually only be rolling one red die. Why? Because that squad, only its flanking fire team would actually be in the close fight initially. The other squad probably masked by their fellows and therefore would not be involved. So suddenly this would be 4 blue die against 1 red die. And when I explain that, people go, oh, now I understand why you're using that system, because it pictorially illustrates the benefits of doing an attack, in this case 2 up. If this attack was 1 up, you could see what had happened. It'd be 2 blue die versus 3 red die, which is not good. And would probably not be the way you do the attack, right? 1 up into the enemy's engagement area, breaking out from what was perhaps your FUP in the creek line out of the trees, and then covering 200 meters of open ground to get to that enemy squad. But 2 up, you can do it because you've got more firepower to the front, and you can see they had flanking fire from an SPF on the left.
What I also like about it is that
unlike a lot of game systems, I get it.
Sorry. What I like about it, unlike a lot of game systems where a close assault is sort of instantaneous and you don't really see the mechanics as you've described, this is probably multi-turn activity and you have options for the assault rather than just moving on to the position and then auto deleting it, or a sort of an exchange of losses, which again is also kind of detrimental to the concept of wanting to go into a close assault. People would then prefer to stand off. So I like it, and the fact that it takes a few goes and requires a lot of die. Well, this is a platoon level game, so maybe one of this is happening at any one time on a particular scenario, and therefore both players are involved and invested in this, as opposed to this detracting from the rest of the gameplay, which I think is a great point.
Yeah, and that you've hit the nail on the head, Ed. Again, when you're doing a fight through, our doctrine dictates that you're traveling 100 meters in about 15 minutes, which is about 6 or 7 game turns. So whilst before, and you'll have a result, it does reinforce in the cadets' heads that a fight through takes much longer than they actually think it will. Because again, I want the game to reflect our understanding of combat and what we have got in our doctrine.
Okay. The rules and aids, we talked about the aid, the 2-pager, which is shown there, which takes you through all the rules in Précis. This is the contents page. Very good to see a contents page in the rules. If you are writing any rules, put a contents page in, helps people get to the right page very quickly. So you can see the introduction, which is a lot of how this is going to work, buying people over to the idea of what the war game is going to do, the standard set of rules, and the optional rules, which we can dive into a bit later. Then some designers' notes, which are also great. And then annexes and illustrations listed there as well. All very easy to get to. I don't think we need to cover any of this anymore, Andrew, unless you want to.
I'll just point out that the introduction is very much a scene setter. I wrote it with the instructor in these types of games and explained the rationale for why we use dice, for example. I explained you need to have a scenario. And probably the most important point is that I emphasize the need for player reflection during the game and also after the game. So to use this as an educational tool, there needs to be player reflection, whether that's facilitated or not. But they definitely need to reflect on what went well and what didn't go well after action review as an instructor, and draw out lessons. If you have the time, that's the best way. If you do not do that, yes, the players will have a degree of reflection, but noting we're talking about, in this case, officer cadets, their level of experience and understanding will not be the same as a senior NCO or a captain instructor, who will see very quickly why something did not go well, and would be able to explain, using doctrine, the principles of the attack, etc., the rationale behind why something didn't work. Whereas a cadet would realise that didn't work, but they don't necessarily understand why. Hence the reason why we teach tactics, right? So, yeah, I thought it was very important to put at the front, noting that this was the sort of first formal manual wargame that was delivered by the Battle Lab. It was important to include that introduction. And I've kept that same sort of introduction in the other wargame that I mentioned, Australian Combined Arms, for exactly the same reason. Because I know that there will be some people that will pick this up who have very little understanding of what we're trying to achieve by playing a manual game. And so that introduction is the scene setter. It explains the rationale behind why you do things, but it emphasises at the end there, you need to have reflection. If you don't have a period of reflection, in my mind, all you've done is literally played a game.
That's a great point for time allocation as well, because often the question is, how long does it take to play the game? When the actual question is, how long does it take to explain the game, play the game, and then debrief from the game? So it's a three-stage process, not just the play the game. And again, first time it's going to be X, second time it's going to be 0.8X, and so on and so forth. And, you know, like the first time you went to any gym, you didn't know where anything was, and your workout was fraction and all the rest of it. And then the one you go to all the time, you're all over it and you're maximizing your time in it. So same sort of analogy with a war game. Often people want to give the answer, it'll take an hour, because that seems to be the sweet spot for the gatekeepers, when really they mean the game is an hour. You need to devote at least 3 hours in the curriculum to really get something out of it. And that's often a discussion which doesn't happen until after the first iteration of the war game. And maybe you can highlight some of that in the playtesting stage.
Yeah, and again, you're right on the money, Ed, because that is exactly what fell out from the playtesting. I always knew that it was likely to take approximately 40 minutes to an hour to actually play the war game. But then if you also include setup, and it's relatively simple and quick to set up, to be fair, it doesn't have the same overhead as a computer simulation does when it comes to setting up something like that, which is one of the advantages of manual game over digital games. But it does require a 5-10 minute setup. You need to obviously set the scenario, play for about an hour, and then with a 10 to 15 minute after action review as a minimum. So you're right, you need more than an hour potentially to get the most value out of any manual game, I would suggest. When we did the play testing, it was really interesting. We played with 2 teams of 3 against one another, so 6 cadets, and with all the instructors looking on, so no pressure on the cadets. But it was quite interesting. I had to explain the very first game turn, the sequence and all the rules and so on and so forth. But after that, they grasped the rules pretty quickly, and within 15 minutes were deeply engaged in playing the war game. And we're talking tactics between each other, and we need to move to a support by fire location. I think it's here, and all the things that you want to hear cadets discussing when they are looking at a tactical problem. It was great. But what I also noted was all the instructors were leaning back, and some of the body language was not, very positive. And then I started to facilitate play, and I started drawing out lessons as the cadets were playing and asking questions. Well, why are you doing that? Why have you selected that location, etc.? And as I started to facilitate play, the attitude of the instructors changed. I think that was when the penny dropped and they realized, now I can see the utility of this manual game as a instructional tool. And they all started leaning in, it was that's when I knew, okay, I think I've succeeded in changing some of the attitudes of instructors who've never seen this as a training tool. And the great thing now is that it's been used for the last 18 months at the Royal Military College. They have moved on in developing how they're using this particular tool. They're doing a lot more manual gaming. They introduce it in third class. Then they start looking at it seriously with tactical problems in second class. And then they do even more in-depth and double-blind games in third class. It's really pleasing to see how the Royal Military College Duntroon has taken on the tool, and now they don't need me to point out, hey, you might use it this way or that way. That they've gone beyond that. They're now doing that themselves, which is fantastic. And I point to the Royal Military College as an example to the other TEs as to with other war games and war game rules that I provided to some of the other TEs, not this particular game. But it's very pleasing to see that RMC in particular has looked at this, and now it's definitely embedded in the curriculum and being used in ways that I'd clearly articulated to the instructors, and they discovered that for themselves, which is great. Designer's notes. I didn't put a lot there. I know, again, in recreational games, some design things are in and why certain things were not. I chose not to do that. I'm happy to answer questions, and I've probably covered a lot of the rationale behind why I've chosen certain mechanics or why the rules are written the way they are in this presentation. But again, I thought it was really important to emphasize the fact that no model of combat will be completely accurate. But it needs to be good enough, as I keep referring to, the descriptor. It needs to be good enough to enable the learning outcomes and to meet, most importantly, the professional judgment of the instructors, and needs to be aligned with doctrine and so on and so forth. So I thought it was worthwhile putting in the designer's notes. As pointed out there, all models are wrong, but some are useful. I hope that this war game is found to be useful by instructors and by unit commanding officers who conduct professional military education. And whilst, yes, they may always be able to find something that they disagree with, then they should be able to apply their own military judgment and house rule the game if they wish to. They have that agency. I'm not going to be put out if somebody disagrees with one of my rules, if they put forward a rational argument as to why they don't agree and they put something else into the game.
Yeah, and top tip for anyone else doing this is to have somewhere where people can write in either to clarify the rules, to suggest new rules and mechanics, and potentially have a format for that, because there's a lot of people who will rush to complain about something or other, but not offer a meaningful mechanic to put into the game to achieve the outcome that they desire. Or often they're their proposal often clashes with an existing rule or requires other aspects of the rules to change. So that's a cascade effect and a lot of problems. So, but it's great to have a place people can message that isn't necessarily the original designer, because as ever with the military, people move on, they post, they retire. So if it's all linked to one person, that person, or a contractor, and that person, goes on to another job, etc., then it can be a weak link. So this is great that this looks like a mailbox that is monitored and people can write into. And also acknowledge your playtesters, because they are the thing that turns your game concept into a game reality. So well done to the second class of the 2023 RMC Duntrine there. Okay, some of the optional rules that I've blown up from the rule book. There's an alternative turn sequence, a number of new assets such as helicopters, features, battle casualties, CPERs, offensive support, fire allocation, a way to look at target acquisition from a more detailed lens, including maximum horizontal visibility and weather, more ISR, fighting at night, military engineering, snipers and close air support. All looks really good. So Andrew, just in broad overview, what were your sort of thoughts about having this and including it as advanced rules and not as in the basic rules?
And if you put everything up front, you will quickly overwhelm a player who has not participated or not played a war game of this type before. You try to stick to the core mechanics of your game up front. And then if it is appropriate to have more detailed rules or rules that will not necessarily be used in every game, then have them as optional or advanced rules, as I've indicated. So I spoke about the alternative turn sequence before. Now, one of the other things that when I designed this game, whilst it was designed principally for the Royal Military College, I had always envisioned the development of a wargaming kit that could be used by other training establishments and also by unit commanding officers to conduct PME. And so having served in an infantry battalion myself, I clearly understood that we don't just move around by Shanks Pony all the time on foot, dismounted. We do vehicle-mounted operations, whether that's in protected mobility vehicles, whether that's in infantry fighting vehicles or armoured personnel carriers. They are normally supported by tanks, so I need to have tanks in the game. We also move around using battlefield helicopters, so I needed helicopters in the game. I've already explained about battle casualties and the fact that I do not go down to the level of detail about, you've had one casualty. That casualty is a Cat Alpha or a Pry 1 who needs to be immediately evacuated from the battlefield. But I thought there may be people who want they're not focused actually so much on the fight. They want to do the reorg and the battlefield clearance and the casualty evacuation. So they need to understand, that part. And so hence the reason why I include helicopters for AME. And I've included more detailed rules for determining battle casualties. So, 10 to 20% of your casualties are going to be KIA. Another 10% are going to be Pry 1s, and then another 10% of Pry 2s, and then about 20% of Pry 3s. And then the remainder are probably okay. They just dust themselves off and continue on with the fight. So that was in there. I also needed to mention the fact that when you overrun the position, there's probably going to be some enemy that will have surrendered. You're going to have captured persons. So I need to include that. OS fire allocation, again, this was more about guiding scenario design. If you give both players masses and masses of fire support, it would unbalance the game. So I know as a former mortarman myself, what number of fire missions would a platoon commander likely to get? It's not a lot. maybe 2, maybe 3 fire missions of 5 rounds, fire for effect. That's it. If they were doing a patrol operation. So I wanted to include that. And then there's more rules around target acquisition. I spoke about the acquisition range. Again, it complements the ISR rules so that you can play with that fog of war mechanic. So you know that, okay, I still cannot see that unit that's in that tree line 200 metres away, which is reality. You probably would not be able to determine that there was any enemy in a tree line 200 metres away. Unless you were using thermal or some other ISR, technical ISR means. I touched on weather, but again, that's really more about scenario design. Remember, a platoon action probably goes for a number of hours. The weather does not, necessarily change that often within that time period. Even in a day, it doesn't change that often. The ISR, one of the things that we spoke about at RMC, which was very important, was ISR in the modern battlefield. We use Nano UAS, which is the only dedicated ISR asset that a platoon commander normally has. So there are rules for that. You can fly that Nano UAS out to 1 kilometre and look on the other side of the hill, or fly it into a building, that sort of thing. So I had to include that, but it's an optional rule. It may not necessarily be core to the learning outcomes. Same with night fighting. Same with military engineering, which we spoke about. Snipers, and then obviously if I'm going to do OS, well, we'll need to include CAS as well. So they're all in there. They do not necessarily need to be used in every single war game. And also the idea being that you learn the basic rules first before you start using more advanced rules. So understand the core CORE mechanics of the game, and then start introducing your optional rules. So that's the rationale behind those rules, Ed, and the reasoning behind why they're optional or advanced.
They're all good sound points, and it also gives a bit of longevity to the system, because if these weren't in, then potentially there would need to be another game produced subsequent to this, which would allow people to get into this level, and people might stop playing the base game because they feel it doesn't have the level of fidelity they want in whatever particular pet rock they happen to be interested in. So it's great that because from a design perspective, adding this in takes rule design, time, space, and playtest space from just punching out the basic game. So there's a trade-off in that sense between releasing Platoon Commander Basic and then making Platoon Commander Advanced almost as 2 separate entities versus releasing them together. I think you've done the right thing. I'm just highlighting that there might be a temptation for some organizations to rush and get the basic thing out the door. And I think that would be a mistake, because it would potentially cut yourself off at the knees for longevity. We're now going to talk about playtesting and reception. So real people playing the game. Andrew, can you talk about where we're looking at and the types of people we got playing and what they thought of it all?
Yeah, so the images there are actually from the officers' mess at the School of Infantry, and this is a training session that I ran last year for the COCI. He requested me to attend the school, and as a PME session, play a number of war games. And in fact, this was not initially the war game that he wanted to play. He himself initially, we'd spoken about playing Littoral Commander Indo-Pacific, because that's a game that he had played himself, he was familiar with, and he thought it was a great game for PME, and I agree with him. But I said, I've also got this Platoon Commander game, sir. Can I bring that along? And he said, yeah, let's do that. We'll play a session of that first. And so this is technically not playtesting, but what happened was we played Platoon Commander in the morning for the first session, and the players were so amored with the game, and the CEO was so impressed. He said, I said, well, sir, we're now set up, to play. Yeah, no. I want to keep playing this. there is value in this game. I want my officers to continue playing Platoon Commander. So we did another 2 sort of sessions, which was excellent. So that sort of gets to the reception. Literally last week, I again went to the School of Infantry, this time to deliver formal training rather than a PME session. And I have now taught the instructors of the platoon team at Tactics Wing how to use this war game. Did that over a period of 2 days. Again, the same thing initially. Well, this is all very interesting. How's it going to work? A couple of, I'm not convinced this is going to be a good thing. And then after playing the first session, it was all the discussion was about how they could use it as a training tool, how they could use it to improve the training that they were delivering on the regiment officers basic course, which is the course that all infantry officers post the Royal Military College have to attend, and also the Subject 2 for Sergeant's course. So the equivalent trained platoon sergeants in infantry. So it was really well received by the school earlier in the year, and also late last year. I've run this game a couple of times for the Land Combat College. Land Combat College actually is the higher level headquarters that commands all of our combat schools. So that's where the instructors from the School of Armour, School of Infantry, School of Artillery, School of Military Engineering, etc., have been exposed and played the game. And again, the theme is always the same. There is a degree of, I'm not too certain about this, I'm not sure whether there's value once they play the game or participate in the war game. Probably a better way of saying it, because it's not a game. Then they see the value. So I think this is probably an important takeaway for game designers. You need people to play the game or your war game for them to fully understand and appreciate what it is. They can admire the box, they can look at them, and they will walk away with an impression. But it will not be as impactful as if they sat there and could give up even 10 or 15 minutes of their time and play one turn. Because invariably what you'll find is they want to play a second turn and a third turn because they become engaged in the game, particularly if it's well designed and it meets their need. With the play testing, I sort of spoke about that earlier when I initially did the play testing with the cadets at the Royal Military College. As I said previously, I was pretty confident that it was going to resonate with the cadets once they saw it and started playing. And that is definitely what happened. As I said before, within 15, 20 minutes, they were completely engrossed in gameplay. And what was most pleasing was they were talking tactics. And ultimately, that's what it's about, right? It's about them developing their understanding, okay, developing tactical acumen, in this case at the platoon level, understanding what it's like as a platoon commander to basically undertake platoon level operations. And that's what the game enables you to do. And as I also mentioned, initially there was that sort of standoffishness from some of the instructors because they'd not experienced this before, and it took, again, an example from myself facilitating play for them to realise, now I see how I can use this as an instructor. I can use it to draw out lessons, to reinforce the reason why a flanking attack might be better than going straight up the guts, or whatever the lessons might be from that particular tactical problem that you want the player to experience and learn by. So that's my experience with play testing and, in a more general sense, the reception. I also showed this game at Connections UK last year. I was very fortunate to be able to come across the UK and attend. And again, the members of the conference who did play the game and view the game all spoke quite well of the game, which I was very thankful of. To hear from other professional game designers and so on that I hadn't made a major hash of my game design, and that was very reassuring as well. So again, very much positive reception. I know I've sent you the digital copies, Ed. I've sent copies of the rules to the US Army, the US Marine Corps, so to Tim Barrett, for example. Also, to West Point is being examined at the platoon level game. It's not the be all and end all, don't get me wrong. But if I could have found who have met the need of the Royal Military College, then I would, in the end, I found something that was pretty close. That was my start point. So again, another point for game designers. Don't feel that other systems where need be, and then
Apologies, there was a small break there. You were just talking about advice for PME game designers.
yeah. So as I was saying, when it comes to designing your game, don't be fearful of looking at other game systems and plagiarizing their mechanics if they work for you and they enable you to, and that they support the objectives of the game, the learning out from scratch. But as I said, I was unable to find a game that was available in the in the recreational wargaming space that met the needs of the Royal Military College and what I specifically want to design. And ultimately, I designed Australian Platoon Commander to meet that need.
I do. That's fantastic and a good rundown. And any viewers, apologies if there's a slight lag or disruption. We are talking from two ends of the earth here, so the Wi-Fi is probably struggling to get us back up. Just to finish off, any final advice for any PME institution looking to start or improve their wargaming programs? I would say go from the start end rather than all the stuff that you've covered so far. So if there's a military college or someone out there in a tactics school who says, I want to start designing a war game, what would be your sort of top 3 things when they're just starting off?
You clearly need a supportive sponsor. There needs to be a requirement for what it is that you're going to design. And that sponsor needs to be in a position to influence the users of your game. Now, obviously, within the military, you can get a senior officer who says you are to And that drives what's happened to command the schools, where the Land Combat College Commander has said you are to institute more manual and digital war games within your schools. So you need that top down. You also need from the bottom up, you need to understand the training audience or the players and their need, so that you meet their expectations, if they have any, and more importantly, that your design covers off on the purpose and the objectives, which in most cases will be learning outcomes that have been specified by the sponsor. And then thirdly, playtest, and get lots of opinions from different people. I've been very fortunate in that I've sent stuff to various people, including yourself, Ed, over the years, asking for feedback. But one of the things that when I first started on this journey, before I became the Staff Officer Grade 2 Wargaming and Simulations, when I didn't have Wargaming in my appointment title, I was finding it very hard to get that sort of feedback from the establishment. So you definitely need somebody who supports you. So again, I'm fortunate in that the commander of the Battle Lab is supporting what I'm doing. I'm fortunate in that there is a 2-star general's direction about reinvigorating wargaming within Army, which is the reason for me doing what I'm doing, apart from the fact that I'm clearly a passionate wargamer and I believe in using manual games. But I think the three things that you need to bear in mind: you definitely need a sponsor, and that sponsor needs to be in a position to influence the organisation when it comes to take up. Otherwise, you might end up spending a lot of time designing something that'll end up sitting on a shelf and never gets used. So that's important. I know, Ed, we haven't really spoken about overcoming the cultural issues that some militaries have when it comes to adopting manual games in particular. That's probably another webinar all in of itself. But yeah, without a senior officer that pushes this as part of their agenda, then you will find it difficult to get a manual war game accepted, and more importantly, becomes normalised. Again, as I reflected, it should not come as a surprise, I suppose, that back in the 80s we were doing manual gaming. Then it declined. Then we started using digital games, and now we've got a whole cohort of officers, senior NCOs, NCOs, and soldiers who have never experienced participating in a serious or a professional war game that we've just been discussing. While some of them have done course of action wargaming, which is a form of war game, it is not the same. And so, that in and of itself is a hurdle. Hence the reason why you need a senior sir who directs. Then at the grassroots level, you need to have people who believe in it, play the game, can see the value in it, promote it, etc. That all helps. So if you only go top down, or you only go bottom up, you may not succeed. But if you've got top down direction and you've got bottom up interest in what you're designing, then you're well on the way. And then ultimately, the most important thing is understand the purpose of the game you're designing and what are the learning outcomes, and ensure that the player and the role that that player has in the game is central to your design. So, as I said before, if you're designing a game and the player is a combat team commander, then you want that combat team commander making the decisions that a combat team commander makes in the real world. He is not loading a sabo round in the left flanking tank within his combat team. That is the job of the loader and the crew commander who's commanding that tank. So they're probably the key takeaways, Ed, I reckon.
That's fantastic. And thank you for being so forthright and honest about the struggles and decisions you've had in making this game. I think it's going to be a great one for people to use as an exemplar for their own stuff. And if they do manage to get a copy digitally or otherwise and play it, then so much the better. So, Andrew, it just leaves me to say thank you for coming on your morning and devoting 90 minutes or so with me. Any final words from you?
No, I think I've probably said enough. Just say thanks very much, Ed, for the opportunity to talk about Australian Platoon Commander and more broadly wargaming in the Australian Army. It's been a very interesting and at times challenging journey. I've just been very fortunate in that I'm being supported by my commander and by the organisation. Again, for those of you out there who are looking at designing games or trying to push manual games in your military, just keep at it. Don't become disheartened. If you can find a senior sir who will sponsor and promote what you're doing, that's all the better. But keep working at it. It will take time. It will not happen overnight. I've been doing this for, as I said, now for 10 years, and I'm finally starting to see some success and take up, which is very pleasing for me. But more importantly, it will lead to the development of better decision makers. Ultimately, that's what this is all about. And hopefully that results in our military being a better military, certainly face an adversary and succeed on the battlefield. And that's ultimately what this is all about.
Yeah, just remember the worst thing they can do is say no, which is often the default setting. But even if it takes a year, maybe two, it'll still be faster than most of the procurement methods we do for digital simulations and so on. So yeah, just go for it. And if you got one designed, share it with someone else. If we all shared the war games we had, classification notwithstanding, then suddenly it becomes a whole lot easier. So Andrew, thank you.